The disciples asked Jesus, "What will be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world?" Christ responds, "Many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold." I think of this when I see the making and manufacturing of a disharmonious world. How the media has propagated the words of false prophets to influence the destruction of family and cultural bonds. I've been contacted a handful of times by people asking me for guidance in which I cannot easily give. People coming to me saying that their family doesn't want to see them because they haven't taken a test or a jab. That even some people are being completely ostracized by their own once very loving family, disregarded as something that is not their own flesh and blood. And this is all by the hands of propaganda, the reshaping of values within the minds of many. And this is what something parasite-stress theory proposes. According to the study called Pathogens and Politics, further evidence that parasite prevalence predicts authoritarianism, it writes the following in its abstract, quote, "According to a parasite-stress hypothesis, authoritarian governments are more likely to emerge in regions characterized by a high prevalence of disease-causing pathogens. Recent cross-national evidence is consistent with this hypothesis, but there are inferential limitations associated with that evidence. Results revealed that parasite prevalence predicted measures of authoritarian governance, and did so even when statistically controlling for other threats to human welfare." End quote. Thus, what we can conclude is that societies and populations are more likely to become conformist to authoritarian behaviour by governments and to adapt their personalities to suit those governments. The author of the book called The Parasite-stress Theory of Values and Sociality, Infectious Disease History and Human Values Worldwide, actually states that government which desire more authoritarian power, such as the likes of, quote, "full-blown fascism or genocide," end quote, could achieve this by, quote, "promoting widespread mortality and morbidity from infectious diseases," end quote. People who at least believe that they are in a pandemic environment succumb to a more collectivist mindset and support such leanings on a political and personal level rather than that of an individualist mindset, or of one promoting such related values, which in so doing brings about the ability for authoritative powers to have greater freedom and wiggle room in violating and reshaping the interests of any given population. According to NexusNewsFeed.com, Eric Gregson, the editor of the Pathogens and Politics study on parasite-stress theory from May 1st, 2013, has interestingly enough also had connections in the past to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation through the likes of being a program officer for the PATH's malaria vaccine initiative. The Gates Foundation was also involved in Event 201, which was a pandemic simulation exercise, in which more or less rehearsed the globalist outcomes in which we have seen and are experiencing today. Other than that, the Rockefeller Foundation published a report called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development, which featured the, quote, lockstep scenario back in 2010, in which described how a supposed pandemic would result in the increased power of globalized authoritarian control, including how it would remain and produce a reconditioned global society of people. Overall, we can come to understand that from these documented exercises and scenarios, the psychological and sociological understandings of parasite-stress theory have been understood and realized, especially when it comes to understanding how it can be used as a way of achieving a higher transfer of power. Of course, something we have seen in the past year. This all, of course, can be slightly worrying when we identify that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is also one of the biggest foundations for funding the World Health Organization, which has more or less led the response of the pandemic itself. According to political scholar Matthew McWilliams, quote, "When political scientists use the term authoritarianism, We are not talking about dictatorships, but about worldview. People who score high on the authoritarian scale value conformity and order, protect social norms, and are wary of outsiders. And when authoritarians feel threatened, they support aggressive leaders and policies." End quote. It all has been quite the ingenious act on how the new modern authoritarian person has been made. For it pulls a heavy curtain over the eyes of the ignorant, and that trick is that no one would think of themselves or others around them as authoritarian when demanding the rules out of a belief from biased ideology called science for the protection and safety of others. But in essence, this is to protect the new social norm in which has been formulated and conditioned into society, in which now through its conditioning is causing people to see freedom as a privilege, and thus one that is not necessary, or at least to make you believe that freedom is a privilege, which you don't always deserve, even with it being your birthright, or that such, quote, privileges are only rewarded and given under certain ideological grounds. An empirical account of parasite-stress theory could adequately be applied to the rise of the authoritarian Nazi state in the 1930s through the disease and use of tuberculosis. In the published document called Nazi Medicine, Tuberculosis and Genocide, it proposes as its main thesis and argument that the Nazi state used TB as a justification for murder and targeted disease by eradicating people. Quote, "In Germany in the 1930s, people with TB were stigmatized, prohibited from marrying, forced to undergo sterilization, and eventually euthanized in the so-called mercy killings. Once the war began, the Nazis used TB as a form of biological warfare. Nazi doctors euthanized TB sufferers through Germany and the eastern occupied lands, or used TB as a convenient excuse to kill those they deemed, quote, life unworthy of life, such as the Jews, whether they actually had TB or not," end quote. As we can see, the authoritarian personality is very much producible when it comes to the told existence and belief of an epidemic parasite, and it is very much the case that there has been a global desire to milk the cow of propagandic opportunity, to not only induce people with something now called maybe, COVID anxiety syndrome, but also to give the mass population under such hypnotism a divided mentality in which looks at the other with emotional disgust, which if left unrealized could mount up and lead to disastrous, disgusting outcomes. With the powers at be knowing this through documentation, it does not come to them as an unknown surprise of the increased inherent power in which they can garner from such said affairs. And, as we have seen so far, how they are not just going to take the opportunity for granted, but with great intentions of power and control. But of course this is all predicated on the observancy of the public, for when propaganda reigns, it is because truth is always hiding in plain sight. If you enjoyed this video and wish to support the channel, you can by becoming a member of the Thoughts on Thinking community, which in return will give you access to our ever-growing library of exclusive video content. More information can be found on my website or through our Patreon servers. All links can be found in the description below. Thank you.